And welcome to The Verdict. I'm Kent Myers, and as you can tell by this shot of our set, Mick Cornett is not here today. I'm flying solo. I can tell you Mick is out doing some good for the city of Oklahoma City and probably other folks in other places, but he's working earnestly. He will be back with us next week. Today is a show that I'm particularly interested in bringing to you because it deals with the protecting our civil liberties. We hear a lot about it. We hear people from all political spectrums talk about it. There is an agency that deals with that on a day-to-day basis. That's the American Civil Liberties Union. They can be involved in questions that bring about public discussion, some quiet, some not so quiet. But we have the law director from the American Civil Liberties Union here with us today, Brady Henderson, whom you'll meet in the next segment. He's going to talk to us about what the ACLU does, what it doesn't do, and what are the pros and cons of the positions that it takes, and what is its agenda, what is it trying to do. So I think you'll enjoy this show today. Join us when we come back from the break. You're watching The Verdict.
I like the idea of improvisation and starting with not a preconceived idea. All of my work is about visual images taken from my memory. I'm Brenda Kingery. I am an artist and I'm a proud Chickasaw. One time I said, "Oh God, please don't let me die with my paintings in the closet." And what I would want them to be is everywhere. I would want them to be loved, to be used, to be respected. You work your whole life doing this. You just keep going as long as you can. And I have such a good background with a 106-year-old grandmother that I've always thought in my mind I would just paint till I am 106. My Chickasaw heritage has become a primary part of my life. And the reason is, it's a place I call home.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to The Verdict. I'm Kent Myers, sitting on the set without Mick Cornett today, but as I indicated in the open, he will be back next week, and he sends his regards to our viewers. Today we're going to be talking with Brady Henderson. He is the legal director of the Oklahoma ACLU. He did his undergraduate work with distinction, I might add, at the University of Oklahoma, where he was named to Phi Beta Kappa. He graduated summa cum laude. He did his law work at the University of Oklahoma as well. He was an assistant district attorney in Cleveland County, prosecuting domestic violence cases for a number of years in that county, in fact 5 years. He then was in private practice, and in 2012, 2012, joined the American Civil Liberties Union here in Oklahoma City as law director or legal director. This is his first visit to The Verdict. Brady, glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate your time. Tell us what's going on at the ACLU.
That's a very broad question.
Yeah.
And the reason it's a broad question is many people don't realize the breadth of what we do on a daily basis. And that is both the challenge and the thing that absolutely makes me love my job. And what it really is in any given day, we deal with everything from issues of over-incarceration to things with DHS, due process, having to do with families, LGBT rights, racial equality, ethnic equality, issues with interpreters for folks who have English as their second language in courts or in medicine. And then that runs the entire gambit from those things to police tactics, excessive force, search and seizure. That even runs further past that gambit to things like First Amendment law, student expression in a high school, religious freedom, religious establishment. All of those things are things I generally deal with on a daily basis. Literally, I've had experiences where I go straight from something to do with license plate scanners and big data in the hands of government, and the next minute I'm turning around dealing with whether or not a student can have a particular religious book in a high school. I mean, it's amazing the breadth of what we do. I think suffices to say what ties it all together, though, is a common theme. And essentially it is that all people should be treated based on who they are, not what they are. That all people have equal rights and liberties, and what that functionally means here in America is simply the ability to be who we are, to be able to engage in civic processes, political processes, business, commerce, equally with one another. Not to have things based on what color our skin is or what gender we are, define what abilities we have to succeed. That's really the commonality of what we do. Much of what we do in Oklahoma has, I think, a second defining characteristic too. And it's that most of the time, we're a brake pedal on government power. So much of what the ACLU does is essentially tell the government no. Tell the government, no, you can't regulate this particular speech. No, you can't get involved in this particular religion decision of somebody. No, you can't search someone in that situation. No, you can't prosecute them for such and such. So much of what we do is essentially that brake pedal. It's that wall that says this far, no further. And of course that changes. And much of what we do in this day and age changes based on things like technology. Things like search and seizure and privacy are a very, very big example. The capabilities that government has now to pry into private lives were unheard of even as little as 10 years ago.
Sure.
And organizations like ours are on the vanguard of trying to figure out where do you draw that line. And it's a very big challenge because often the law we're working with, the constitutional law, is over 200 years old. And yet we're trying to apply it to cutting-edge technologies, to cloud computing, to big data, to things that were so far beyond what the framers of our country could have imagined that they wouldn't have even considered it science fiction because they didn't even know what science fiction was. I mean, this whole concept of what we do on a daily basis was completely unheard of. And again, that as not just an advocate, but as a lawyer, is one of the things that we get to do on a daily basis. And as much as it's a challenge, I absolutely love doing it because the questions it presents are profound, they're impactful, and let's face it, they're fun and interesting to answer.
Well, I get kind of amused sometimes at folks who kind of recoil when the letters ACLU are thrown out to them because they think, oh my gosh, that's an organization that is so far akin to what I believe, I can't believe that you're dealing with it. And then the follow-up question is, well, don't you want the U.S. Constitution enforced? Aren't you on your gun rights? Don't you want the Constitution enforced? On your freedom of speech, don't you want? And while they may not like the particular position that's being taken on a particular issue, when you ask them those questions, they are very much in favor of having their rights enforced under the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And so I guess the U.S. Constitution is your principal charter for what you do.
It is. I mean, it's not just the U.S. Constitution. It's state constitutions like Oklahoma's. It's laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, you know, it's not just the Constitution itself, but I think for those things that are out of statutes or state constitutions, the commonality is they're all things like the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, that further what the Constitution starts, that further this idea that's inherent in the American system of government and that is absolutely brilliant, and that is simply that the people are ultimately the ones in power, that government exists to serve the people. And that was something that was revolutionary when this country was founded. I'm not saying that nobody had ever done it before, but merely that was really why we fought a revolution, in that sense of revolutionary. It's something that is very much profound, and yet in this day and age, sometimes people don't appreciate it. They don't actually think about what that means. And that's where I think so much of the criticism of organizations like ours comes from people who don't always understand that you don't really want to take the freedom for granted. One of the hazards in having really an incredibly stable government, an incredibly good history of civil rights being extended to more and more parts of the population through American history, a tradition of justice and of equity, is that people can take it for granted. They sometimes don't often realize what has happened in the history of this country and how easily you can slip from a system defined by justice to a system defined by injustice. And we've done it at times in our history. And so one of the challenges is exactly what I think you just hinted on. Sometimes it's helping somebody to understand that our freedoms rise and fall together. So for instance, it's helping a person who's straight understand, here's why it matters for somebody who's gay to have a particular right, because your rights rise and fall with theirs. In fact, that's a phrase often you'll hear from folks with whom we're adversaries many times, like Liberty Institute or the Becket Fund, who are proponents of things like the Ten Commandments Monument. Even they will say, we're organizations that are about Christianity, and yet, like you, we value the rights of Muslims, the rights of somebody who's Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, because we realize that our religious rights rise and fall with theirs. And again, that's something that's so profound about our system of government. And oftentimes, I think people don't always understand.
We've got just about a minute left in this segment. Give us a brief history of the ACLU generally and in Oklahoma, a very brief one.
Well, you can say we truly had our start as a First Amendment free speech organization, and that was back when Woodrow Wilson was president. And essentially, we were founded based on folks who wanted to protest what ultimately became known now as World War I. At that time was simply the World War. Yeah. And
the Great War.
The Great War at that time. And at that time, it was considered inappropriate to protest against a war. The government said, you can't do that. That's sedition. You can't do that. If we're at war, you've got to be behind it. Well, that's about, ironically, the government would have said this is about patriotism, and yet that's about the most un-American concept imaginable, to say that if we're at war, we must all agree about everything and nobody can have any dissent. And so the ACLU was really founded on that principle. Now in Oklahoma, our affiliate came about later. The ACLU in the second half of the 20th century started to transition into affiliates operating now in, I believe, pretty much 50 states. I think we may be down to 49, if I remember right, but we also have Puerto Rico, some of the territories, and then a national organization as well, and we're defined in a kind of a federal structure, like the actual states in the Union, where, for instance, I control a lot of what happens in our Oklahoma affiliate, but work with our national office for support and guidance as well.
We're going to have to take a break, and we'll come back to that when we are back from the break. You're watching The Verdict. We are pleased today to have Brady Henderson on, Legal Director of the ACLU. We'll be right back.
I didn't know that there were abandoned oil well sites on the property, but it turns out there were 3 of them. We saw those commercials, but never did we ever dream that it was going to happen out here. OARB came out and they cleaned up these old sites for us. And when you look at what they've done, it's absolutely fantastic. This whole plan out here is for the grandkids and just generations to come. The process is simple. Pick up the telephone. It's worth a phone call. Trust me, it's worth it.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back. Kent Myers here on the set of The Verdict without Mick Cornett only for this week. He'll be back next week. We're with Brady Henderson, the legal director of the Oklahoma ACLU. Brady, in our first segment, you mentioned the Ten Commandments controversy. Is your office involved in it, and if so, how?
We are definitely involved in it. In fact, we brought the case that was recently decided by the state Supreme Court. Now, we're not the plaintiffs, we're the lawyers on it.
Yeah.
The plaintiffs, originally there were 4 plaintiffs. One unfortunately passed away from ill health while the suit was ongoing. The 3 that are remaining, to many people's surprise, kind of reads like a bad joke, 2 Baptists and a Methodist, but one of which is a minister. You know, we can start with a Baptist minister goes into court, and but the reason I start with that is actually because you mentioned the controversy. So much of the Ten Commandments controversy has brought out an incredible amount of disinformation as to what's going on, unfortunately. And the truth about the case is really relatively simple. The people who just won this victory in the state Supreme Court, all of whom actually believe they're not atheists, they're not agnostic, which is often how these challenges go. They end up acting as, or people look at them as referenda on whether we should have a religious or secular world. And these are all folks who are Christians who say, I believe the Bible is true. My problem with the Ten Commandments isn't that it offends me as if it isn't true. It's that it's something fundamentally sacred to me. It's a covenant between God and man, and it shouldn't be used for political purposes. It shouldn't be connected into civic government in this way, where one translation, one version of this message is essentially slated as the right one. And in fact, one of the phrases I think that came out of the case was we said, you know, it's not just about this particular monument, it's really about something larger going on, where there's an incredible movement right now for government to try to use the, if you will, the moral authority of religion to back itself up. And we've seen that even in things like the so-called Merry Christmas bill last legislative session, where the proponent of that bill came out and talked about what he wanted the bill to be in terms that most Christians would talk about the Bible. And he talked about, for instance, saying, I want Christians to have a beacon shining from our state statute books, a light, if you will. Well, of course, Christians talk about Jesus as the light of the world. And it's, in a sense, it's government starting to say, we've figured out that if we can have moral authority of God behind us, then pretty soon people can't really question what we do. We simply have to be right. It's a way for us to be able to do something and appear like we can't be corrupted. Well, of course, the founders of our state understood that temptation, and they understood that over here you have faith and religion, which at least are supposed to be incorruptible. And then you have politics, which unfortunately is frankly defined by corruption for many people. You have, on the one hand, something that values love, mercy, on the other, money, power, things like that. And so the framers were very smart about that of our state. They put a provision that is called Article 2, Section 5, and that's what this lawsuit was based on, that essentially says the state doesn't get to go into the religion business. It doesn't get to support a particular religion or religious view. It has to stay out of it. And if you look at why the framers put this in, the contemporary sources, the actual writings of the Bill of Rights Committee, people writing in, citizens, prominent leaders at the time, they had not just the view of keeping religion out of government, it was all about keeping government out of religion for them, because they believed that it corrupted that process. And in a sense, that's what we're looking at today. It's really a fight over government authority, not over one slab of granite. It's fundamentally a fight about, does the government get to set a particular religious agenda and then tell us that it's not religious, tell us that, you know, these plaintiffs, for instance, are being told that part of the Bible is not true. Not really.
Let me ask you, there was a good bit of discussion in the press and in the cases about the Texas system. And Texas has a monument on its state capitol grounds, I think, among other historical monuments.
That's right.
With the Ten Commandments. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said, as I understand it, that basically is okay. How is that distinguishable from what we have in Oklahoma?
There are a couple of different things going on. One is different constitutional provisions.
Okay.
The Texas case was decided under the federal First Amendment
Yes.
rather than the state provision.
And you didn't, this case in Oklahoma was not brought under the federal First
That's
Amendment.
right. Now, there was another case that was brought under the First Amendment, and it'll probably be moot now, actually,
Yeah.
because of this one.
Yeah.
But for instance, whether or not it violates the state amendment doesn't really, or it's not an amendment, the Constitution,
Right.
doesn't really affect what happens in a First Amendment case, and vice versa. But one of the things is you've got a different part of the different Constitution. But you also have more important things going on, frankly. And the day that this Texas case was decided, the U.S. Supreme Court decided two cases, put the decisions out at the same time. They were both state Ten Commandments monuments, and they reached the opposite conclusion.
How do you reconcile that?
And here's how they did. And it confused a lot of people, and it continues to confuse a lot of people. Of course, it's controversial. So this Van Orden case, this Texas monument, they said, okay, that passes muster. And what they looked at was mainly context. They said, what we're trying to figure out, we get the Ten Commandments as religious, but we're trying to figure out if a person walking up to it on the Texas Capitol grounds is going to say, oh, this means my government is endorsing this particular religious message. In the Texas case, the Supreme Court said no, based mostly on context. And a lot of that were things that are absent in Oklahoma's case, one of which was this monument was basically down away from the Capitol, amongst a series of all kinds of other monuments that actually were there dealing with specific civic organizations, movements, various things in Texas history that were very specific. And in fact, this one had to do with a group called the Fraternal Order of Eagles that had done work with troubled Texas youth. So the court said, okay, well there's already something going on there that tells us there's something else besides religion happening here. But the biggest thing they noted was the fact that the monument had been there about half a century before anybody thought to challenge it, before anybody said, I think something's going on here that's more like state endorsement of religion. In Oklahoma's case, that period was non-existent. It was instantly controversial. And the Kentucky case, which was also decided the same day by the Supreme Court, reached the opposite result. A big factor there was, like Oklahoma, that was a new monument. Yeah. And one of the things that some of the justices talked about that I think is very profound, they said, look, if you're looking at what was going on in the 1950s and 60s and what's going on now in America, we live in a day and age where religious dialogue works differently. It's broader, it's bigger, if nothing else, simply because there are now large numbers of citizens of religions such as Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, that just weren't there in the 1950s and 60s in our civic life. And so people look at this differently. There's a different political climate going on. That's how they ended up reaching these two different results. And Oklahoma's monument, the facts are essentially in between those two cases. And that's what's tough about it for constitutional lawyers to look and say, well, what would have happened had this been a federal case? Well, I think it would have been struck down based on the fact that it's new, it's divisive, all these things that were so important. But I would never say that was the only possible result. We don't know. We don't really know exactly what would have happened.
It seems like there's a broad range of issues that you could get involved with, certainly more than you have staff to deal with or resources. How does the Oklahoma ACLU decide which issues they're going to get involved with and which ones they're going to pass on?
Well, what we try to do is always have a combination of proactive and reactive things going on. We don't have a quota of exactly how many cases we take, but we have a small enough staff that constantly, anytime we look at taking a case, we have to figure out, do we have the resources to follow through? One thing that may surprise many people, at any one time, we have a very small number of cases actually in a court being litigated, but we have a much larger number of cases where we're working collaboratively or in settlement with someone behind the scenes, or in a way that isn't actually in court. A great example of that is how often we get involved in issues with schools, with religious freedom of students or expression. The law in those areas is pretty well settled. It's not unusual. And so it's very easy for us often to deal with a problem collaboratively with a school.
Without litigation.
Exactly. And we try to whenever we can, because litigation by its very nature is not very efficient.
Well,
if you can work with somebody, it makes a lot more sense.
I've been in litigation all my life, and I certainly agree with that. That's going to have to be the last word for this. Brady, thank you so much for coming. You're watching The Verdict with the guest Brady Henderson. I'll be right back with some final words.
There are now 11 million of us who live here and work here. I was 15 when I came here 6 years ago. I raised my family here. I drive my truck to my job every day. The only difference between now and 6 years ago, I do it legally. I wanted to. Because this is my home.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
I really think people are so unaware of the number of kids waiting just in Oklahoma. And I think if more people knew that those children were out there waiting, I think that just by the way we live our lives and the people we talk to, that maybe we can help encourage adoption from Oklahoma.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to The Verdict. This is Kent Myers closing our show with Brady Henderson, the legal director of ACLU Oklahoma. Appreciate his time very much and him explaining the role of ACLU in our life here in Oklahoma. There's a website I want to bring to your attention to get a hold of Brady if you'd like. It's acluok.org. That's acluok.org. And of course, we have a website that we want you to check and let us know what you'd like to see, what topics you'd like covered. We will see you next week. Thanks for watching.